So, starting down the pathway of studying pathophysiology, we kind of have to figure out what is pathophysiology and why do we want to study it. So, the learning objectives for this section are to explain the role of pathophysiology in the diagnosis and treatment of disease. And we'll talk about the different levels of prevention in healthcare and the role that physical therapy may play at the various levels. So, pathophysiology it involves the study of functional or physiological changes in the body that result from a disease process. So, really, we are going to talk about the development of disease, the changes to normal anatomy or physiology. We're going to go we're going to review what's normal, and then how do we know when it's not normal, and what do we do when that happens. So, we're going to use our knowledge of basic anatomy and physiology and we're going to add to it. We're going to add a lot of terminology. Pathology as a study is the laboratory study of cell and tissue changes associated with disease. So that's part of pathophysiology. But part of it is trying to identify those cause and effect relationships. What causes those cellular and physiological changes? And we're going to define a lot of the diseases that we study by signs and symptoms. And that's going to guide our study of a specific disease and specific classes of diseases. So this is a two-quarter sequence. And in the first quarter, we're mostly going to be talking about body-wide systems that deal with pathological changes. And then in the second quarter, we're going to drill down into more individual systems and individual disorders with those systems. So the whole idea of our body's job is to maintain homeostasis. So homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment, regardless of external changes. So it's cold outside, I don't get cold, my body changes in order to maintain a stable internal environment. And a lot of times, the stable environment that we're trying to maintain is the environment that our cells need to do their job, to perform the chemical reactions that are doing to give us energy, to do all the different jobs that the cells do in our body. If the internal environment stays optimal for that, well, then that's called health. So that homeostasis is maintained. And it's not a static place, it's very dynamic. Things are always changing, but the body has to do that balancing act of things change. We change something a little bit to tweak it back into the center. So there is always a movement, but it's tightly regulated. And the body is doing the regulation. So a lot of our control systems include the nervous system, the endocrine system. A lot of they all interact to prevent disease, really, or to maintain homeostasis. When homeostasis isn't maintained, you may develop disease because your cells are not working with an optimum environment. So if we want to define health and disease, we can say health is physical, mental, and social well-being. And disease is the opposite of that, I guess. It's a deviation from the normal state of homeostasis. So the disease can be any kind of deviation from normal structure or function of any part of the body, of any organ or any system, or a combination of all those things. So all of the systems that we talk about are very interdependent and very intercoordinated, and not one of them acts alone. And when we start getting into more organ systems, you'll see that it's crazy how much they're coordinated, just crazy. So we have really, we can define a state of health, but how do we measure that? There are differences among individuals, obviously. There are differences in genetics, in age, gender, environment, activity level. But we have what we consider to be our normal values of health indicators, and those are anything we can measure, any signs and symptoms. And normal values occur within a range of values, and they might vary depending on the technology that you use for measurement. So a good example of that is you're going to take somebody's temperature. There are lots of different ways to do that, right? You can do just your classic oral thermometer, stick it under their tongue. You can do the digital form of the oral thermometer. You can do the little thing that they point at your forehead or stick in your ear. Those are usually a little easier. You can do an axillary temperature underneath the armpit. You can do a rectal temperature, not something we normally do in PT, but it can be done. So your normal values are going to change depending on what technology you use for measurement. So I like to use the example of in the early days of COVID, and I was working at the hospital. I don't live very far from the hospital, and I walk everywhere. And so I was walking to the hospital, and it was in, March, April. It was kind of cold. And so I'd walk over there in the morning, it'd be cold, and they had people at the door taking everybody's temperature. And they were using the little forehead thermometer thingies. Well, I just walked over there in the cold and they measured, they couldn't even get a reading a lot of times on my forehead. So they would have me do, they would do it on my chest or my arm or someplace underneath my coat. So the normal value, I didn't have a fever and my temperature wasn't super low either. It just, the normal value was varying depending on the technology that we use and the environment. So I just came in from the cold. I'm going to be a little colder on the outside of my body, but hopefully my systems are maintaining homeostasis on the inside of my body, so my cells are doing just fine at their optimum temperature. So box 1.1 in the book is called 7 Steps to Health. So how do you maintain homeostasis? What are the things that we can do? Obviously, there are some things that are out of our control. And when we talk about different diseases, we'll talk about things that are modifiable risk factors and unmodifiable risk factors. We can't do anything about our genetics. We can't do anything about, a lot of times we can't change the environment significantly. We can't change a lot of things, but there are things we can change, and these are the 7 things that we're going to do to help maintain homeostasis. Being a non-smoker and avoiding secondhand smoke, we can do that. That's easy, hopefully. Eating 5 to 10 servings of vegetables and fruit a day, and choosing high fiber, low fat foods, and limiting alcohol intake. So I've really been working on this the last year or so. Been working on increasing my intake of vegetables and high fiber, and that sort of thing, and limiting alcohol intake. So far so good, but it's always an experiment. Physical activity on a regular basis as and physical therapist assistants, that's our wheelhouse, right? We want to promote physical activity. Protection from the sun, that's important for avoiding certain types of skin cancer and some other issues. Following cancer screening guidelines, and we'll talk about that at the end of this quarter. We'll talk about cancer screening guidelines. Doctor or dentist visit if any changes in the normal state of health. So really noticing if something's different that's not your normal state, and then following up on that. And following health and safety guidelines at home and at work when using, storing, and disposing of hazardous materials. So that was another thing that we used to joke around about at the hospital during the COVID days is we'd say that, oh, we're not going to die from COVID, we're going to die from disinfectant poisoning. Well, disinfectant is a hazardous material. Hopefully it's hazardous to microorganisms, but it's also not very good for you too. So you should be wearing gloves and stuff while you're handling those types of materials. And we'll talk more about that in the infectious diseases chapter. So lots of fun stuff to come. So really prevention of disease and disability should be a primary focus in healthcare. It isn't always, but it should be. The kind of maintenance thing we do, like maintaining routine vaccination programs, participating in screening programs like cancer screening, um, community health programs, regular routine doctor visits, just to make sure that we're staying on top of things. Nothing's getting too crazy. Nothing's getting too out of hand. So there are different levels of prevention. Ideally, we want to prevent disease. We just don't want to get it. So that we're going to talk about three different levels of prevention. There is a box in chapter 1 that lists out sort of examples of those. Those are nice little things to know. Primary prevention is we want to protect healthy people from getting sick in the first place, right? We don't want to develop a disease. So the kind of things that can be thought of as primary prevention are education about good nutrition and the importance of regular exercise and the dangers of alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. And education legislation about proper seatbelt and helmet use. That's important. And regular exams and screening tests to monitor risk factors for illness. So if you have a family history of certain diseases, your doctor might recommend different screening tests because you have that in your family. There are routine ones that are generally done for all of the population. And it's just a way of trying to prevent things before anything bad happens. And controlling potential hazards at the home and in the workplace. So one day I think I was cooking salmon or something in the oven and I lit it on fire. I didn't do it on purpose, but it happened. And so I closed the oven door. I'm like, oh, what am I supposed to do? Well, the next day, a fire extinguisher showed up in my kitchen. The fire extinguisher fairy delivered it. So yeah, that's what I should have done is I should have controlled that potential hazard by having a fire extinguisher in my kitchen. It's in there now. I have a fire blanket too. So just knowing what potential hazards are and trying to control them, that's a good way to not get sick or injured in the first place. Secondary prevention is usually after you have been diagnosed with an illness or had trauma of some sort, or you have serious risk factors like high cholesterol levels or something like that. The goal of secondary prevention is to halt or slow the progress of disease as much as possible and catch it in its early stages. So, in the case of an injury, so someone has an injury, you might want to limit long-term disability and prevent re-injury. So, an example is so you have say you have the serious risk factors for heart disease. Your doctor might tell you to take a daily low dose aspirin to prevent a first or second heart attack or a stroke. It's good. Let's prevent those things. Um, Recommending regular exams of screening tests for people with known risk factors for illnesses. So one of the screening tests that most everybody gets is a colonoscopy. And up until recently, you got it when after you turned 50, they would send you for a colonoscopy. Now they changed the recommendations to 45. So after you turn 45, you'll go get a colonoscopy to assess your risk for colon cancer. People who have known risk factors, like a strong family history, might have to get it more often than people who don't have that history. When you go in and you have your first normal one, usually they'll tell you um, when you should come in next. And I was lucky when I had my first one, they said, don't come in for 10 years. So that's a good sign when they say that. If they say, come back next year, maybe they found something in there that they want to keep an eye on. So we're just trying to prevent problems from happening. Suitably modified work for injured workers, that's going to prevent long-term disability or limit long-term disability and prevent re-injury. So that's always a challenge in physical therapy when we're working with people with work injuries is does the person's workplace really understand what modified work is and what light duty means? And is there a light duty option for their job? There might not be. They might have to do something else. Tertiary prevention focuses on helping people manage complicated long-term health problems, such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and chronic pain, chronic musculoskeletal pain. So in tertiary prevention, you already have it. You have the disease, whatever it is. And the goals are to prevent further deterioration and maximize quality of life. So stroke or cardiac rehabilitation programs. And we're involved in that a lot in physical therapy. Chronic pain management programs, that's another thing that we're involved a lot in physical therapy. Patient support groups. So now you've got people who have these chronic, complicated long-term health problems, and we want to help prevent issues.